Thank you so much, Maya. And I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Devika, to Nada, to the entire teams at Tate, Alserkal, and Ishara for gathering us all together, and to all the presenters for such a wonderful day of presentations. It's been extremely productive and thought-provoking to be part of the symposium today. And I think what I'd like to do is, just to consider two main questions, which is, given that the pressures of catastrophic climate change and the attendant impacts on population are imminent, it's more important than ever to consider the environment as a crucial agent when assessing the impacts of urbanization. So the second question would be, what might the artist's role be within that matrix, and what tools and perspectives do artists offer? So my discussion today will focus on a few projects undertaken by artists in South Asia, specifically in India, although there have been some really significant projects in Bangladesh and Pakistan. And these projects that are intervening directly into the natural environment and specifically into bodies of water. And we're going to sort of look at these as ways of understanding the kind of entangled relationships between capital and urbanization, between notions of the global and the local, and how these all sort of produce discourses of futurity and how they sort of produce kind of a way of looking at the environment as an agent. And so in tracing these questions of liquidity and finance, I am very indebted to the work of Hito Steyrl, who in her essay film Liquidity Inc. considers the flows of capital within the paths and roots of globalization, and also to the recent volume by Sugata Roy and Venugopal Madhipati, whose, so the edited volume is called Water Histories of South Asia, and it introduces this concept of liquescence. And they note significantly for my project and for today's discussion that in 2008, water was already a global commodity with an emerging class of exchange-traded funds and water utility stocks. So there's this model of financialization that's very tied to the literal physical bodies of water that I think is really important to understanding urbanization and artist projects within South Asia. I do want to emphasize that what I'm looking to do in today's discussion is not necessarily to privilege or foreground connections in the same way that either Steyrl does, nor to account for material historiographies in the same way that Madhipati and Roy do, but to consider how perhaps in a metaphorical, maybe poetic way, ebbs and flows of capital, artistic and intellectual labor, they operate as a kind of metaphor for moving and flowing, and within that sort of flow, how artist interventions operate as a way of navigating these kinds of transactions, and how they also interject within these networks of global capital and operate as sort of stopgap measures or sort of mini dams. Calorie Easterling makes a really interesting point in her analysis of satellite programs between Dubai and India, that satellite imagery that was adopted for military strategic purposes in other nations were actually used in India for nation building projects and sort of resource management in the same way that dam projects were used earlier. So in the same way that, quote, dam building was thought to reorient infrastructures around natural resources, satellites might be a resource stored in the air, or returning benefits to all they touched regardless of previous urban and political structures. So I want to keep that in mind as one way in which there is already sort of an infrastructure or a legacy of water and infrastructures of water within the urban landscape and urban development of India. So one point that I found quite interesting in my research, and I'll note here also that this is a project that's kind of developing and it's in process, so I'd like to think through this with you all. But one thing that I found quite interesting was that in 2016, following the destruction of wide swaths of the nation by disastrous floods, Sri Lanka signed an agreement amounting to 42 million US dollars for what is known as a catastrophe deferred drawdown option, a CDDO, which is a contingent credit line that provides immediate liquidity to middle-income countries after a natural disaster, which is when liquidity constraints are usually highest. So there are these really interesting ways in which the sort of networks of global finance are so tied to natural disasters, which are increasing, as we speak. The sort of risk of floods is increasing with catastrophic global climate change, and the measures enacted by institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF are made to deal with these, but they come with so many strings, and there isn't a way to predict exactly, even though we can predict how much floods, seawaters will rise, there isn't a way to predict how much this might impact the economy, the entire GDP of Sri Lanka down the line. So that's another thing to bear in mind. So according to another 2016 World Bank report by Peter Ellis and Mark Roberts, in the decade between 2001 and 2011, South Asia's urban population grew by 130 million people. So in the next 15, the population is slated to grow by 250 million more. And it's really interesting to look at these reports and really analyze the kind of language that they're using. So the way that they use, the language that they use to describe this process of urbanization is that it is, quote, messy and hidden. It's marked by issues of congestion and agglomeration. So the way that they measure modes of urbanization is by sort of the implementing measures of like job security and job development and sort of the aggregation of people coming together and how that affects people's ability to secure work or secure housing, secure resources. And all of these are sort of marked by a failure at what they regard in South Asia for effective policy implementation for housing development and environmental policy change. So already we're establishing this sort of rhetoric by which the South Asia region is marked by these failures to implement certain measures and certain standards of international development by organizations such as the World Bank. And this kind of rapid and incredibly invasive financialization, this abstraction of resource allocation, this abstraction of sort of the way that people kind of make a living in response to environmental change is, I think, quite significant, and when we consider how urbanization is even measured or considered within that region. And I want to think about, as we kind of go through this presentation, how that might later, these kinds of abstractions might later impact how these policies are understood, but also might be one sort of reason why an artistic intervention, abstractions in their own right, might be almost, perhaps not the only solution, but perhaps one very effective solution as a counter to this kind of rhetoric. So again, I am indebted to Hitesh Tyrrell and Sugata Roy and Vani Ultra for their analysis. I think that that kind of precursor that Hitesh Tyrrell did in the essay film particularly is quite revolutionary in the sense that forging these connections or attempting to make these kinds of connections is a way of perhaps, one could argue that it reduces some sort of the specificity of the particular problems in South Asia or wherever you are geographically. But I do think it is important in an era of technological advancement, in an era of financialization that does sort of reduce in some really significant ways why the sort of mode of analysis that privileges these kinds of connections is important. But for the purposes of today, I'm not trying to draw the same kinds of lines. I'm just trying to sort of sketch out a possibility for understanding why artistic interventions might be significant. So to do a little bit of historiography, so one way that I was thinking about understandings of the natural landscape and understandings of development was to look back at colonial photography. So these are photographs from Udaipur in the collection, the Maharana of Mewar, and they track the development around kind of Udaipur Lake and the development of an urban architecture within that framework. And what's sort of some touch points are that the first photographic society was established in Bombay in 1854. But by the 1860s, photography was a part of courtly life in Udaipur. The Maharaja spent much of his leisure time in photography, and that collection of photographs that's in the Maharana of Mewar collection actually goes from 1860s all the way to 1970s. And another thing that I found quite interesting in this research, that the majority of the photographs that were printed were actually of landscapes and architecture, but there's so many negatives that are actually just portraits, but they weren't printed. And I wonder, this is kind of just a little bit of a side, but I thought this was a really interesting kind of historical background. And then in the post-independence era, I'm going to sort of whiz by this, but this is the work of Sunil Jinnah, who was a member of the CPI. He was later kicked out, but he was known mostly for his photographs of the Bengal famine pre-independence, but he grew to a lot of greater fame with his photographs of industrial projects during the Nehru period. And I wanted to focus specifically on his photographs of the Damodar Valley Corporation, which was the first multi-purpose river valley project of independent India. And it was modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States during the Depression. And Jinnah, because of his sort of Marxist leanings, although he did this kind of industrial photography, he later really wanted to focus on the workers, on the people who were building these dams, and I think that material history, that sort of labor history, is also really significant in thinking about the environment as something that was acted upon. I think in the Nehru period there was this, and here I'm thinking also to this the sort of rhetoric and the analogies that we saw in the film last night of this sort of socialist promise of this development projects as this nation-building project. But later, Sunil Jinnah would talk about how he regretted that he did not emphasize more the individual people who were involved in that. But I do think that these interventions on water, documented as they were in this sort of industrial photography, speaks a lot to the nation-building project of India, but also into why there is this precedence, there is this legacy of like intervening into bodies of water that have a lot of religious significance, spiritual significance, but also a lot of civic architecture is contingent upon that. And the way that artists would later, as we'll see, kind of work on that, I do think, even if it's not directly acknowledged, is really tied to this legacy of these socialist-leaning kind of civil infrastructure projects. So the first of the projects that I'll talk about is the Coj International Artist Residency. So Coj, since the 1990s, has been really involved in a lot of public art projects, and I think one of the really great things that they've done is this project called Artist as Witness, Landscape as Evidence. They staged a hearing before a commission of inquiry requesting that the river linking projects under the Commissions of Inquiry Act in 1952 were, it considered that as a form of evidence. And this was led partially by the Koj International Artists Association, Zuleika Chaudhary. And it goes back to some of the Narmada Bachao Andolan resistance projects. So in 1993, the Indian government was forced to withdraw from a nearly $3 billion USD loan from the World Bank for a massive dam and irrigation project. That loan was given out in 1985, and what it was intended to do was provide drinking water to 3 million people and irrigate crops to feed 20 million more. But in that process, it would flood 12,000 hectares of forest and displace 100,000 people. So in 1993, the World Bank did this analysis kind of to check on the project, and they saw that the project failed to meet two important requirements, which was analysis of tribal displacement and the socioeconomic survey of people in Gujarat. And what happened was that the Indian government just decided to finance the rest itself. Of course, that was met with a lot of different protests. You had everyone from, Arundhati Roy to, prominent, significant artists, writers, and cultural practitioners really working against this rhetoric that would this project that would displace so many people. And I thought that Koj's staging of this civil process, this trial, was a really interesting format to intervene within that, because what they went back to was in the early 1970s, Dr. Rupender Bakshi, she submitted a preliminary petition against the Narmada Sarovar project, and I want to read this quote that I thought was quite interesting. I want not land for land, but a running brook for a running brook, a sunset for a sunset, and a grove of trees for with shade for a grove of trees with shade. So my right to life is a right to my specific civilization mode of being in the world. And I cannot be rehabilitated or compensated outside of recreation of what life means to me. And I think that these projects, and they've done other public projects that, with Sureka dealing with Jakur Lake, and this series is called Ecology of the Byways. So financing these kinds of projects, they're quite broad in their scope. They don't have a directive necessarily, but they are kind of experimental in their research based. I thought that they're an interesting way of thinking about artist interventions. The second artist that I want to consider is Shiva Chachi. So Shiva Chachi, she's been working with the Yamuna River for a number of years. In 2011, she did a project called Black Waters Will Burn. But the one that I wanted to focus on was a project that she did in 2008 as part of the Public Art Festival, 48 degrees Celsius, Public Art Ecology. She went to the formerly closed basement of the Delhi Public Library, which is at one point a colonial swimming pool. And I just think these connections are so fascinating. And she installed her work, The Water Diviner. The project was a journey that traced the flow of water from pre-modern to colonial times. And what she did was the fountains were closed, and she reinvigorated them. She installed them and made black water flow from their spouts, and then projected this immersive installation of oceanic blue light, and that was casted on these books from the project. And it takes as its metaphor the Yamuna as this sensual goddess wounded by anthropogenic factors. And to quote Sugata Roy, a goddess to be worshipped and a problem to be managed, a source of life and a repository of urban waste. And then one of the other projects that I want to consider is Vibha Gulhotra. In 2015, she developed the project 365 Days. Over the course of a year, she collected water samples from the Yamuna and displayed them, accompanied by short text from local inhabitants, and the short film Manthan, which invokes a Hindu myth in which the gods turn the ocean to obtain a solution that grants immortality. So these connections between, life, sustenance, water, and I want to think about their relationship to both the artists intervening on this collective land or these collective bodies of water that are essential to the national imaginary, but also to specific publics as well. And then the last project I'll talk about is Anurada Mathur and Dilip Dukuna. They're landscape architects based in Philadelphia, and they utilize GIS and spatial analysis to map alternative cartographies of urban environments. So SOAK reimagines 12 maps of Mumbai that considers how the landscape's ability to soak up rainwater during monsoon season and how mapping those really kind of subverts centuries of colonialism, and that sets the stage for flooding by arbitrarily demarcating an edge between the land and the estuary. So looking back at colonial histories, intervening on them through new technologies as a way of negotiating history, but as a way of negotiating very present problems. So these issues of capital and the flow of capital are maybe we can locate them in the development of globalization and the economic liberalization of India, but the histories of water go back, centuries further. And I think that these kinds of negotiations between maybe 20 years ago to 200 years ago, et cetera, they all consider water and ecology as material. And in considering that, perhaps they sort of reimagine what it means for that material and that ecological thing for anthropomorphic change as a form of manipulation. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks.